The afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the manicured lawns of Blackthorne House, where the annual memorial garden party was reaching its genteel crescendo. Mrs. Helena Blackthorne, the widow of the late Colonel Reginald Blackthorne, had opened her grounds to the entire village of Little Wickham for this charitable event, ostensibly to raise funds for the war memorial restoration. However, as Miss Jane Marple observed from her carefully chosen position beneath an ancient oak tree, the undercurrents of village society were flowing with considerably more turbulence than the placid surface suggested. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes moved thoughtfully across the assembled guests as her knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm. She had arrived early, as was her custom, positioning herself where she could observe without seeming to do so, a skill honed through decades of what she modestly called taking an interest in people. The scene before her was quintessentially English. White marquees dotted the emerald lawn like elegant mushrooms after rain, while the gentle clink of teacups provided a delicate counterpoint to the murmur of polite conversation. Mrs. Helena Blackthorne moved through her guests with the practiced grace of a woman accustomed to command, yet Miss Marple detected something theatrical in her bearing. The widow was an attractive woman in her early 40s with auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon and intelligent green eyes that seemed to calculate even as they charmed. Her mourning attire had evolved, Miss Marple noted, from the stark black of 6 months ago to today's sophisticated dove-gray silk with subtle pearl accents. A transformation that had not escaped the village's collective notice. "Such a lovely turnout," remarked Mrs. Dolly Bantry, settling herself in the adjacent wicker chair. "Though I must say, Helena seems remarkably vibrant for someone so recently bereaved. Some might say almost too well recovered, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. "Grief affects people differently, my dear Dolly, though I've observed that some find comfort in keeping very busy indeed." Her gaze followed Mrs. Blackthorne as she approached a distinguished gentleman with silver hair near the rose garden. "And some find it an entirely unexpected companionship." The gentleman in question was Dr. Marcus Thornfield, a recently retired London physician who had taken up residence in the village just 3 weeks after Colonel Blackthorne's sudden death from what the local doctor had termed cardiac complications. The frequency of Dr. Thornfield's subsequent visits to Blackthorne House had provided endless fodder for village speculation. Near the refreshment tent, Miss Marple observed the village's other notable figures arranging themselves in the complex social patterns she had learned to read like sheet music. There was Mr. Julian Marchmont, a London art dealer who had been a frequent guest of the Blackthornes and who seemed to regard the memorial gathering as an opportunity to assess the value of the widow's possessions with barely concealed professional interest. His pale eyes lingered on the silver tea service with an intensity that suggested more than aesthetic appreciation. Young Lily Pemberton, Mrs. Blackthorne's companion and distant cousin, moved efficiently between the marquees, her plain dress and anxious demeanor marking her as someone dependent on others' charity. Miss Marple had noticed how the girl's hands trembled slightly when arranging the memorial display, and how her eyes darted frequently toward the house as if expecting some unwelcome revelation. The village postmaster, Mr. Reginald Hartwell, stood in animated conversation with the vicar, but his attention kept wandering to Mrs. Blackthorne with an expression Miss Marple recognized as that of a man nursing a long-held grievance. The Colonel's will had been read publicly, as was traditional, and certain debts mentioned therein had caused considerable embarrassment to several village families. As the afternoon progressed toward the formal unveiling of the restored memorial plaque, Mrs. Blackthorne announced that refreshments would be served in the conservatory, where the Colonel's prized orchid collection was displayed. The guests moved in small groups toward the glass structure attached to the main house, their conversations taking on the slightly forced joviality that often accompanies such ceremonial occasions. Miss Marple, moving with her characteristic unhurried pace, found herself among the last to enter the conservatory. The air was thick with the humid fragrance of exotic blooms, and the late afternoon sun streaming through the glass created an almost tropical atmosphere. She had just accepted a cup of tea from Lily when a sharp cry pierced the gentle murmur of conversation. Mrs. Blackthorne stood frozen beside a magnificent display of purple orchids, her face ashen, one gloved hand pressed to her throat. At her feet, partially concealed behind a large planter, lay the still form of Mr. Julian Marchmont. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his face bearing the unmistakable pallor of death, and clutched in his right hand was a small ornate key that Miss Marple recognized as belonging to the Colonel's private study. Dr. Thornfield was beside the body in an instant, his professional competence evident as he knelt to examine the fallen man. After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, he looked up with grave finality. "I'm afraid Mr. Marchmont is dead. The circumstances?" He paused, glancing meaningfully at Mrs. Blackthorne. "I believe we must summon the police immediately." As the conservatory erupted in shocked whispers and nervous movement, Miss Marple remained perfectly still, her keen eyes cataloguing every detail. She noted how Lily Pemberton's face had gone chalk white, how Mr. Hartwell's expression showed more satisfaction than surprise, and how Mrs. Blackthorne's initial shock was already being replaced by something that looked remarkably like calculation. Most interesting of all was the small detail that everyone else had missed, a single white orchid petal, crushed and browning, that lay near Mr. Marchmont's left shoulder. Miss Marple knew enough about Mrs. Blackthorne's prized collection to recognize that particular variety, a rare specimen that bloomed only in the Colonel's locked private greenhouse, a structure that had remained sealed since his death. The key in the dead man's hand suddenly took on a significance that made Miss Marple's pulse quicken with the familiar thrill of a puzzle presenting itself. Whatever Julian Marchmont had discovered in the Colonel's study, it had cost him his life, and Miss Marple suspected that the elegant widow of Blackthorne Lane knew exactly what that discovery had been. As Constable Williams arrived to secure the scene and Dr. Thornfield began the grim business of examining the body more thoroughly, Miss Marple quietly folded her knitting and prepared herself for what she recognized would be a most complex and dangerous investigation. The memorial garden party had become something far more sinister, and she had the distinct feeling that Mr. Marchmont would not be the only victim before the truth was finally revealed. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower through the conservatory glass, casting long shadows among the orchids, and Miss Marple settled herself to observe what she suspected would prove to be a masterfully orchestrated deception. The widow of Blackthorne Lane had secrets worth killing for, and Miss Marple intended to uncover every one of them. The news of Julian Marchmont's death spread through Little Wickham with the peculiar velocity that only village tragedy can achieve, transforming whispered speculation into established fact before the evening shadows had fully settled across the green. By morning, Miss Marple found the entire community buzzing with theories, each resident having developed their own explanation for the shocking events at Blackthorne House. Mrs. Dolly Bantry intercepted her at the corner of Church Lane, practically vibrating with excitement and moral indignation. "My dear Jane, you simply cannot imagine the stories circulating. Mrs. Pembroke insists it was robbery gone wrong, though what Mr. Marchmont could steal from a conservatory defies imagination. That dreadful Mrs. Whitmore suggests Helena poisoned him with exotic plants, as if the woman were some botanical assassin." Miss Marple murmured appropriate responses, while carefully filing away each piece of information, noting how quickly the village had divided into camps of suspicion and defense. At the post office, Mr. Hartwell held court behind his counter, his usual discretion abandoned for dramatic revelation. "Always said that Marchmont fellow was trouble," he declared to his audience of elderly ladies and the arty baker's apprentice. "Sniffing around the Blackthorne place like a bloodhound, making those mysterious London trips. Mark my words, he was mixed up in something unsavory. and it finally caught him. The postmaster's satisfaction was barely concealed, and Miss Marple remembered his expression from the previous afternoon with renewed interest. She purchased stamps with quiet efficiency, lingering long enough to hear him add with particular venom, "Some people think they can waltz into respectable villages and conduct shady dealings without consequence." The official investigation had been assigned to Inspector Craddock from County Constabulary, a competent if unimaginative man who arrived that morning with determined expectations of solving a straightforward case. Miss Marple encountered him emerging from Blackthorne House, his expression suggesting frustration rather than satisfaction. "Peculiar business, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat respectfully. "The deceased appears to have suffered some sort of seizure, though he was healthy. Dr. Thornfield found no obvious violence, but circumstances are decidedly odd." He paused, studying her face with the hopeful expression of someone who had learned to value her observations. "Mrs. Blackthorne claims no idea why Marchmont would have her late husband's study key, insisting the study remained locked since the Colonel's death 6 months ago." The inspector's revelations proved increasingly intriguing. Dr. Thornfield's examination had revealed traces of unusual substance on Marchmont's fingertips, something plant-based requiring laboratory analysis for proper identification. "The doctor thinks it might be natural toxin, possibly from those exotic conservatory plants. Apparently, some orchids can be dangerous if handled improperly, though Marchmont was knowledgeable about such things." Miss Marple filed this information with particular care, remembering the crushed orchid petal she had observed near the body, a detail that seemed to have escaped official notice. Dr. Thornfield himself appeared as they spoke, approaching with measured stride and bearing important news. "Inspector, I've completed preliminary examination, and we may be dealing with something more sophisticated than accidental poisoning," the doctor announced, his London accent carrying immediate authority. "The substance on the deceased's fingers appears to be concentrated extract from Dendrobium nobile, a particularly toxic orchid variety requiring careful preparation to achieve lethal potency. This was not accident nor casual plant contact. Someone with considerable botanical chemistry knowledge deliberately administered this poison." Miss Marple felt familiar intellectual excitement accompanying truly complex puzzles. The case was proving far more intricate than village gossips imagined, involving not merely local jealousies and financial desperation, but specialized knowledge and careful premeditation. As Dr. Thornfield explained the poison's properties and effects, she studied his face with renewed interest, noting his ease discussing such deadly substances and wondering what sort of London medical practice he had conducted before his convenient retirement to Little Wickham. The investigation had already focused on the obvious suspect. Lily Pemberton, the widow's companion, had been seen in animated conversation with Marchmont earlier, and several witnesses reported she appeared distressed throughout the garden party. "The young woman is clearly hiding something," Inspector Craddock confided. "Claims she barely knew the deceased, yet Mrs. Whitmore distinctly remembers seeing them together near the conservatory shortly before discovery. There's also her desperate financial situation. She's entirely dependent on Mrs. Blackthorne's charity, and rumors suggest her position was becoming precarious." Mrs. Blackthorne herself approached from the conservatory direction, carrying cut flowers and wearing determined composure. "Inspector Craddock, I hope you're making progress with this dreadful business. The entire village is in uproar, and I confess I'm beginning to feel unsafe in my own home." "Her performance was flawless," Miss Marple observed, conveying perfect mixture of concern and vulnerability, yet something in the widow's green eyes suggested calculation rather than genuine fear. Miss Marple quietly excused herself and made her way toward the conservatory, intending to conduct her own examination before too much time passed. The crushed white orchid petal tucked in her handkerchief remained her private knowledge, a tiny detail easily overlooked, but speaking of struggle or unexpected encounter in a place where such rare blooms should not be accessible. The Colonel's locked greenhouse was separate from the conservatory, and that specific orchid was his obsessive pride. Why would a petal from such protected plant be found near Marchmont's body? The key, the orchid petal, and the widow's too perfect composure were threads Miss Marple began quietly weaving together, forming nascent patterns of her own far more intricate theory. Miss Marple returned to the conservatory the following morning with the unhurried purpose of someone collecting wildflowers, though her true quarry was far more elusive than botanical specimens. The police tape marked where Julian Marchmont had fallen, and Constable Williams stood guard with the dutiful expression of someone hoping nothing further would happen on his watch. She offered him shortbread from her basket, a gesture that earned grateful acceptance and momentary distraction while her keen eyes catalogued details overlooked in yesterday's chaos. The humid air carried scents of exotic blooms and damp earth, but also something else that made her pause. The faint, lemony fragrance of furniture polish mixed with lavender, such as careful housekeepers use on banister rails, clinging inexplicably to the brass lock of the door leading to Colonel Blackthorne's private greenhouse. The lock itself told an interesting story to those who knew how to read such things. Fresh scratches bristled around the hasp like silver whiskers, and a trace of wax clung to the edge where someone might have taken an impression. Miss Marple remembered a dear boy in St. Mary Mead who had copied his mother's pantry key in soap, warming it with a candle to preserve the shape perfectly. The technique was simple enough for anyone with patience and opportunity, though it suggested premeditation rather than sudden passion. She examined the greenhouse door more carefully, noting a faint scuff mark on the ground as if something heavy had been dragged, and the way dust had been disturbed in patterns that spoke of recent, secretive activity. Inside the main conservatory, she discovered other telling details that spoke of hasty tidying after yesterday's discovery. A smear of pale soil marked the shelf at shoulder height rather than hip level, suggesting a tall person had steadied themselves there, while a fine thread of silk caught on the roof vent lever matched the quality of expensive gloves. The watering can showed dampness, though the orchids displayed the telltale signs of selective, recent watering designed more for appearance than proper horticulture. Most significant was the crushed white orchid petal she had privately preserved, which she now identified as Phalaenopsis Aphrodite, a rare variety Colonel Blackthorne had cultivated exclusively in his locked private greenhouse, not the public conservatory where Marchmont's body was found. Her investigation was interrupted by Lily Pemberton's arrival, the young woman appearing breathless and distressed, carrying twine with hands that trembled despite obvious efforts at composure. Miss Marple's gentle questioning gradually drew out the girl's terrible burden of knowledge. Marchmont had approached her during the garden party, claiming he possessed something that could help them both if she would assist him. He had asked specifically about Mrs. Blackthorne's access to the Colonel's study and whether Lily had seen a small key with a lion's head design. When she denied knowledge of such things, he had requested her help in distracting Mrs. Blackthorne during the memorial unveiling, explaining he needed to check something in the house that might save them both from unspecified danger. The phrase, "save us both," struck Miss Marple as particularly significant, suggesting Lily and Marchmont shared some common vulnerability that a prosperous art dealer would not normally experience with a dependent companion. Lily's subsequent revelation proved even more illuminating. Marchmont had hinted that Colonel Blackthorne kept detailed records of items that had passed through the house, paintings and other valuable objects that were not always what they appeared to be. The implication of forgeries in the Colonel's collection cast new light on Marchmont's profession and his frequent visits to Blackthorne House, suggesting business dealings far more complex than social calls. Inspector Craddock's investigation had meanwhile focused with predictable intensity on Lily as the obvious suspect. Her nervous demeanor, financial dependence, and witnessed conversations with Marchmont created a compelling narrative of desperate crime that satisfied both police efficiency and village expectations. The community had quickly embraced this explanation, with Mrs. Whitmore declaring it exactly what one might expect from someone with no proper background relying on charity. Even Mrs. Blackthorne contributed subtle encouragement to this theory, describing Lily's devotion to the Colonel in terms that suggested unhealthy emotional attachment and possible instability when confronted with perceived disrespect to his memory. Miss Marple observed these developments with growing skepticism. Lily's distress appeared genuine rather than calculated, her fear that of someone trapped rather than someone concealing guilt. More telling was Mrs. Blackthorne's careful management of the situation, steering suspicion toward her companion while maintaining perfect composure that suggested relief rather than grief. Dr. Thornfield's behavior proved equally suspicious, his immediate expertise regarding exotic plant toxins and his convenient arrival in the village shortly after the Colonel's death creating patterns that demanded closer examination. The key found in Marchmont's hand remained central to understanding his final actions. Mrs. Blackthorne insisted it opened only her husband's study, claiming the room had remained locked since his death 6 months earlier. Yet the presence of the rare orchid petal from the private greenhouse suggested Marchmont had gained access to areas supposedly sealed, discovering secrets worth killing to protect. Miss Marple began to perceive the outline of a conspiracy far more sophisticated than village gossip imagined, involving art forgeries, carefully planned murders, and a widow whose grief masked dangerous calculation. The obvious suspect was merely convenient camouflage for crimes requiring expert knowledge and cold-blooded planning that poor Lily Pemberton could never possess. Inspector Craddock returned from the county laboratory with renewed confidence, his notebook filled with what he considered decisive evidence against Lily Pemberton. The toxin found on Julian Marchmont's fingers had been identified as a concentrated alkaloid from Dendrobium nobile, requiring sophisticated extraction methods that suggested deliberate poisoning rather than accidental contact. Miss Marple received this information with quiet interest while serving tea in her garden, noting how the inspector's satisfaction seemed to blind him to the very complexity that should have raised questions about his chosen suspect. A young woman dependent on charity would hardly possess the chemical knowledge necessary to create such lethal concentrations, yet Craddock appeared convinced that desperation could overcome any lack of expertise. Mrs. Blackthorne demonstrated remarkable composure in managing the crisis, hosting an intimate tea gathering that afternoon to demonstrate the community's resilience in the face of tragedy. The widow moved among her carefully selected guests with practiced grace, expressing appropriate sorrow while subtly reinforcing the narrative that painted her companion as increasingly unstable. Dr. Thornfield attended with professional authority, discussing the exotic poison with disturbing familiarity and explaining how certain orchid species contained alkaloids that could prove fatal if properly concentrated. Miss Marple observed his easy expertise with growing suspicion, wondering what sort of London medical practice had required such specialized knowledge of botanical toxins. The examination of Colonel Blackthorne's study proved particularly illuminating, though not in ways Inspector Craddock fully appreciated. Mrs. Blackthorne had insisted the room remained sealed since her husband's death 6 months earlier, yet Miss Marple detected subtle signs of recent disturbance. The leather-bound volumes showed gaps where books had been removed and replaced, while faint scorch marks in the fireplace suggested documents had been burned recently. Most telling was a small bead of red sealing wax on the desk blotter, brittle and half-melted, indicating correspondence had been opened and resealed with hasty efficiency. Miss Marple's discreet inquiries revealed fascinating connections between Marchmont and the Blackthorne household that extended far beyond social visits. The art dealer had been under investigation by Scotland Yard for suspected involvement in forgery schemes, though charges had never been filed due to insufficient evidence. His expertise in authentication made him valuable to collectors seeking questionable pieces, while his reputation provided cover for transactions that might not bear close scrutiny. The Colonel's extensive art collection suddenly took on sinister significance, suggesting business partnerships that had turned deadly when one party decided to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. The timing of Dr. Thornfield's arrival in Little Wickham deserved careful consideration. He had appeared in the village just 3 weeks after Colonel Blackthorne's sudden death, claiming retirement from a London practice, yet displaying remarkable vigor in pursuing the newly widowed Helena. Mrs. Bantry had observed him at the railway station carrying laboratory equipment, ostensibly for botanical research, though his explanations seemed oddly defensive for such innocent scholarly pursuits. The coincidence of a medical expert in exotic toxins arriving shortly before a sophisticated poisoning stretched credibility beyond reasonable limits. Lily Pemberton's arrest proceeded with efficient inevitability, though Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the convenient nature of the evidence against the girl. The young woman's nervous temperament and financial dependence made her an ideal scapegoat for crimes requiring far more sophisticated planning than desperate improvisation. Her tears appeared genuine rather than calculated, her fear that of someone trapped rather than someone concealing guilt. More significantly, her hands showed the honest calluses of domestic work, not the soft fingers that would handle delicate chemical apparatus or create perfect wax impressions of complex keys. The widow's performance throughout the crisis remained masterfully calibrated to deflect suspicion while encouraging focus on her unfortunate companion. She spoke movingly of Lily's devotion to the Colonel, describing emotional instability when confronted with any criticism of his memory or suggestions that his collection might contain questionable pieces. Her suggestion that police search Lily's room led to the convenient discovery of botanical reference books and pressed flower specimens, materials common among country dwellers yet easily interpreted as evidence of dangerous interests in plant toxicology. Miss Marple began to perceive the outline of a conspiracy far more sophisticated than village gossip imagined. The partnership between Mrs. Blackthorne and Dr. Thornfield appeared to extend beyond romantic attachment to criminal collaboration involving art forgeries, carefully planned murders, and the systematic elimination of witnesses who threatened their profitable deceptions. Poor Lily served merely as convenient camouflage, her vulnerable position making her perfect for bearing guilt that belonged to far more calculating criminals. The challenge now lay in proving these suspicions before an innocent young woman faced the ultimate penalty for crimes she could never have committed. Miss Marple settled into her evening knitting with the familiar satisfaction of a puzzle beginning to reveal its true pattern, though she recognized that exposing such sophisticated deception would require considerable delicacy and patience. The Widow of Blackthorne Lane had orchestrated her deadly performance with remarkable skill, but even the most careful criminals eventually made mistakes that observant eyes could detect. Miss Marple began her morning with the methodical precision of someone who understood that truth often hid in the most mundane details, visiting first the ironmonger's shop where Mr. Pritchard's eager helpfulness revealed that a duplicate lion's head key had been cut just a fortnight earlier by a gentleman with London manners and hands that smelled faintly of carbolic. The customer had paid cash and requested beeswax sticks for what he claimed was draft-proofing, though Miss Marple recognized the material's more sinister potential for taking key impressions. At the post office, Mr. Hartwell's constitutional inability to mind his own business proved invaluable when he confided that 2 registered letters from a London gallery had arrived for Mrs. Blackthorne 3 days before the garden party, one returned within an hour bearing fresh sealing wax, suggesting hasty opening and resealing of important correspondence. The key found clutched in Julian Marchmont's dead hand had troubled Miss Marple from the beginning, not for its presence, but for its condition. Inspector Craddock had shown her the brass lion's head key as definitive proof of the art dealer's intentions, yet something about its pristine appearance struck her as fundamentally wrong. A key supposedly used to force entry into a study locked for 6 months should bear microscopic traces of its struggle with the mechanism. Tiny scratches from the lock's interior, perhaps dust from disuse or oil from the tumblers. Instead, this key gleamed with suspicious cleanliness, as if it had been carefully wiped or, more disturbingly, had never actually been used to open the study door at all. This observation shattered the neat narrative that had satisfied Inspector Craddock and the village gossips. If Marchmont hadn't used the key to enter the study, then why was it in his possession, and what had been his true objective that afternoon? The crushed white orchid petal Miss Marple had preserved took on renewed significance, for she had identified it as belonging to a rare variety cultivated exclusively in Colonel Blackthorne's private greenhouse, not the public conservatory where the body was discovered. The geographical impossibility of this evidence suggested Marchmont had indeed gained access to the sealed greenhouse, encountering something or someone that had cost him his life. Her discreet examination of the Colonel's study, conducted under the guise of helping Mrs. Blackthorne organize papers, revealed additional inconsistencies in the official story. The heavy oak door's lock showed no signs of recent forced use, its metal surfaces smooth and well-maintained rather than bearing the scratches that would result from 6 months of disuse followed by hurried entry. More tellingly, she discovered traces of recent activity throughout the room. Books displaced and carelessly replaced, faint scorch marks in the fireplace suggesting document destruction, and a small bead of red sealing wax on the desk blotter that matched the material found on correspondence at the post office. The widow's behavior during this period revealed subtle cracks in her carefully maintained facade of grieving propriety. Mrs. Blackthorne moved through her social obligations with practiced grace, yet Miss Marple detected calculation beneath the sorrow, particularly in how she guided conversations toward Lily Pemberton's supposed instability and desperate circumstances. Dr. Thornfield's presence became increasingly protective rather than romantic, his medical expertise extending to uncomfortable familiarity with exotic plant toxins and extraction methods that suggested professional rather than scholarly knowledge. The art forgery connection began to crystallize through careful observation of the house's contents and the relationships between its inhabitants. Marchmont's frequent visits had clearly involved more than social calls, and his growing unease in recent weeks suggested a partnership turning dangerous. The Colonel's extensive collection, viewed with fresh suspicion, showed signs of pieces being moved and possibly replaced, while correspondence fragments in the study's wastebasket bore letterheads from galleries known to Scotland Yard for questionable authentication practices. Poor Lily Pemberton remained in custody, her nervous temperament and financial dependence making her perfect for bearing guilt that belonged to far more sophisticated criminals. Miss Marple's conversations with the girl revealed genuine confusion rather than calculated deception, the fear of someone trapped rather than someone concealing guilt. The botanical reference books found in Lily's room were common among country dwellers, hardly evidence of the specialized chemical knowledge required to extract concentrated alkaloids from exotic orchids. The timing of Dr. Thornfield's arrival in Little Wickham deserved particular scrutiny, coinciding suspiciously with the Colonel's sudden death and preceding Marchmont's murder by mere weeks. His retirement from London practice, initially explained as seeking rural tranquility, now appeared more likely connected to Scotland Yard's investigation into art forgery rings. The laboratory equipment Mrs. Bantry had observed at the railway station, ostensibly for botanical research, took on sinister implications when considered alongside his expertise in plant-based toxins. Miss Marple recognized that she was observing a conspiracy of remarkable sophistication, involving multiple murders disguised as natural deaths and accidents, systematic elimination of witnesses, and the careful manipulation of evidence to implicate an innocent victim. The partnership between Mrs. Blackthorne and Dr. Thornfield extended beyond romantic attachment to criminal collaboration. Their shared knowledge of art authentication and botanical chemistry creating deadly opportunities for profit and protection. The challenge lay in proving these suspicions before additional lives were lost, as the conspirators had already demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice anyone who threatened their elaborate deception. As evening shadows lengthened across Little Wickham, Miss Marple settled into her knitting with the familiar satisfaction of a pattern beginning to reveal itself, though she knew the most dangerous moves in this deadly game had yet to be played. The morning brought revelations that shifted the foundation of Little Wickham's comfortable assumptions about Julian Marchmont's death, though these discoveries came not through official investigation, but through Miss Marple's patient cultivation of village confidences and careful observation of overlooked details. Her first call was to Mrs. Cribbins at the ID King's Arms, where Marchmont's valise remained unclaimed, its contents providing a fascinating glimpse into the dead man's final concerns. The leather case bore traces of red sealing wax in its handle's groove, while a silk thread caught in the brass clasp matched the quality of expensive gloves, suggesting hasty packing by someone other than its owner. Most significantly, the valise contained correspondence from galleries known to Scotland Yard for questionable authentication practices, along with detailed photographs of paintings that bore suspicious resemblance to pieces in Colonel Blackthorne's collection. Mrs. Bantry's unexpected contribution proved equally illuminating when she produced, with characteristic dramatic flair, a packet of old photographs discovered while organizing charity auction donations. One image, seemingly dropped by accident before Mrs. Blackthorne during their afternoon tea, showed Colonel Blackthorne at a London charity ball years earlier, standing beside a younger Dr. Marcus Thornfield in what appeared to be familiar conversation rather than casual acquaintance. The widow's reaction was carefully controlled, yet telling, a momentary flicker of annoyance before she dismissed the connection as coincidental, claiming her late husband knew everyone in certain London circles. The revelation of Helena Blackthorne's hidden past emerged through the vicar's wife, whose excellent memory for faces recalled the widow as Helena Carraway, a discreet companion in Eaton Square who had attended botanical lectures under various assumed names. This pattern of assumed identities and careful anonymity suggested someone with experience in avoiding official scrutiny, while her specialized knowledge of exotic plants took on sinister implications when combined with Dr. Thornfield's chemical expertise. Miss Marple began to perceive a partnership that extended far beyond recent romantic attachment, involving shared knowledge of both art authentication and botanical chemistry that created deadly opportunities for profit and protection. Poor Lily Pemberton's situation grew more desperate as Inspector Craddock's investigation focused with increasing certainty on her supposed guilt. Yet Miss Marple's visit to the girl in custody revealed crucial information that the official inquiry had dismissed. Lily confessed that Marchmont had pressed a folded note into her hand during their final conversation, instructing her to read it only if something happened to him. The note, now confiscated as evidence of conspiracy, had contained what Lily described as numbers and names that meant nothing to me, but seemed to frighten him terribly. This suggested Marchmont possessed specific evidence about the forgery operation, information valuable enough to justify murder, yet requiring careful handling to avoid exposing the entire conspiracy. Mr. Hartwell's bitter revelations about the Colonel's business practices added another dimension to the web of motives surrounding Marchmont's death. The postmaster's family had lost valuable land near the old mill through what he termed legal chicanery, involving documentation that Marchmont had been investigating in the weeks before his death. This suggested the art dealer's interests extended beyond forgeries to include property fraud and other financial irregularities that could implicate prominent village figures. Hartwell's satisfaction at Marchmont's demise now appeared rooted in personal revenge rather than mere gossip, though his obvious relief suggested someone else had eliminated a troublesome investigator on his behalf. Dr. Thornfield's defensive reactions to Miss Marple's gentle probing about botanical toxins confirmed her growing suspicions about his role in the conspiracy. His initial expansiveness about plant-based poisons gave way to guarded responses when she mentioned specific extraction methods and the subtle signs of alkaloid poisoning. Most telling was his physical reaction when she described a hypothetical scenario involving rare orchid sap, a sudden tension in his jaw and narrowing of his eyes that spoke of guilty knowledge rather than academic interest. His convenient arrival in Little Wickham shortly after the colonel's death, combined with his immediate romantic pursuit of the widow, suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The art forgery connection deepened through examination of the colonel's collection and correspondence found in Marchmont's valise. Several pieces showed signs of recent replacement or alteration, while letters from London galleries discussed authentication concerns and provenance irregularities that required discreet handling. Mrs. Blackthorne's portrayal of Marchmont as a charlatan attempting to devalue her inheritance appeared to be deliberate misdirection, concealing a partnership that had turned deadly when one party decided to expose or exploit the other's criminal activities. Miss Marple recognized that she was observing a conspiracy of remarkable sophistication, involving multiple murders disguised as natural deaths, systematic elimination of witnesses, and careful manipulation of evidence to implicate an innocent victim. The partnership between Mrs. Blackthorne and Dr. Thornfield represented a combination of specialized knowledge and ruthless calculation that poor Lily Pemberton could never possess. Yet the girl's vulnerable position made her perfect for bearing guilt that belonged to far more dangerous criminals. The challenge lay in proving these suspicions before the innocent faced ultimate penalty for crimes requiring expertise and planning far beyond desperate improvisation. As evening shadows lengthened across Little Wickham, Miss Marple settled into her knitting with the familiar satisfaction of a pattern beginning to reveal its true complexity. The Widow of Blackthorne Lane had orchestrated her deadly performance with remarkable skill, supported by a partner whose medical knowledge provided both means and method for their elaborate deceptions. Yet even the most careful criminals eventually made mistakes that observant eyes could detect, and Miss Marple intended to be watching when those crucial errors finally revealed themselves. The most dangerous moves in this deadly game had yet to be played, but she was beginning to understand the rules by which her opponent operated. The tranquil evening of Little Wickham was shattered by the urgent clanging of the fire bell, its bronze voice carrying across the village green with news that would prove far more significant than mere property damage. Miss Marple, roused from her evening knitting by Mrs. Bantry's breathless telephone call, arrived at Blackthorne House to find the colonel's private greenhouse transformed into a beacon of destruction against the September darkness. The glass structure that had remained sealed since the colonel's death now blazed with theatrical intensity, its panes exploding like gunshots, while thick smoke rolled across the manicured lawns in oily waves that spoke of accelerants rather than accidental ignition. Dr. Thornfield emerged from the chaos with precisely calculated heroism, his face artfully streaked with soot, and his breathing labored in a performance that would have impressed the Lyceum Theatre. He had, according to breathless witnesses, attempted to rescue the colonel's irreplaceable orchid collection from the flames, only to be driven back by the intense heat and toxic smoke. Mrs. Blackthorne received his gallant failure with gratitude that bordered on advertisement, her pale composure suggesting relief rather than genuine distress at the loss of her husband's botanical treasures. Miss Marple observed this tableau with growing suspicion, noting how conveniently the fire eliminated the very evidence that might have supported her theories about exotic plant toxins and their deliberate extraction. The discovery that transformed mere arson into calculated manipulation came when Constable Williams, poking through the smoldering wreckage with determined thoroughness, unearthed a partially burned document bearing the lion watermark of Blackthorne House stationery. The surviving fragments, their edges artfully charred, revealed what appeared to be a confession in a trembling hand. "I cannot live with the shame of what I did to Mr. Marchmont. The guilt consumes me. Forgive me. L." The collective sigh of relief that greeted this revelation had the quality of a village-spared complicated thinking, yet Miss Marple's trained eye detected numerous inconsistencies that transformed apparent resolution into deeper mystery. The forged confession bore hallmarks of sophisticated deception that poor Lily Pemberton could never have orchestrated from her prison cell. The paper's edges showed signs of deliberate aging with flame applied from without, rather than natural burning, while the paste that had secured it to the brick foundation had melted to a glossy consistency more consistent with sealing wax than ordinary adhesive. Most tellingly, the watermark faced the wrong direction entirely, the lion's head pointing left rather than right, as it appeared on the new stationery Mrs. Blackthorne had ordered after her husband's death. Such details spoke of hasty preparation by someone unfamiliar with the household's recent changes, yet confident enough to stage evidence in the midst of a carefully orchestrated fire. Miss Marple's examination of the scene revealed additional layers of deception that confirmed her growing understanding of the conspiracy's true scope. The padlock that had supposedly secured the greenhouse for 6 months lay in the gravel, some distance from the structure, its hasp unbroken and its metal surfaces gleaming as if recently polished rather than weathered by exposure. The surrounding soil showed evidence of recent watering, with dark tide marks along the surviving bench slats, indicating someone had been maintaining the supposedly abandoned orchids in secret. Most significantly, she detected the lingering scent of lamp oil beneath the acrid smoke, while Dr. Thornfield's cuffs bore ember burns in patterns too neat for genuine rescue attempts. The systematic nature of the evening's events became clear when viewed alongside the broader pattern of witness elimination that had characterized the case from its beginning. Julian Marchmont's death had silenced an art dealer whose investigations threatened to expose forgery operations, while tonight's fire destroyed botanical evidence that might have revealed the sophisticated extraction methods used to create his poison. The convenient confession provided perfect closure for official minds eager to avoid complex investigations. Yet its very perfection betrayed the calculating intelligence behind what appeared to be desperate improvisation by a trapped servant girl. Mrs. Blackthorne's management of the crisis demonstrated the same masterful manipulation that had characterized her response to every previous development. She moved among the gathered villagers with practiced grace, expressing appropriate sorrow while subtly reinforcing the narrative of Lily's guilt and instability. Her suggestions that the fire resulted from the girl's final act of desperation provided convenient explanation that avoided more threatening questions about the systematic elimination of evidence and witnesses. Dr. Thornfield's supporting performance, complete with heroic injuries and professional commentary on the dangers of exotic plant combustion, created a compelling tableau of tragic coincidence that satisfied official curiosity while concealing criminal coordination. The revelation of Mr. Hartwell's sudden illness that same evening, discovered collapsed in his post office with symptoms suggesting mild poisoning from contaminated tea, added another dimension to the conspiracy's expanding reach. The postmaster's knowledge of Colonel Blackthorne's questionable land dealings and his recent vocal satisfaction at Marchmont's death had made him a liability that could no longer be tolerated. His convenient indisposition, attributed to bad shellfish by Dr. Thornfield's swift diagnosis, effectively silenced another voice that might have connected the art forgeries to broader financial irregularities involving property fraud and document manipulation. Miss Marple recognized that she was witnessing the final phase of a conspiracy of remarkable sophistication involving multiple murders disguised as natural deaths and accidents, systematic destruction of evidence, and the careful manipulation of official investigations to focus on convenient scapegoats. The partnership between Mrs. Blackthorne and Dr. Thornfield represented a combination of specialized knowledge and ruthless calculation that poor Lily Pemberton could never possess. Yet the girl's vulnerable position made her perfect for bearing guilt that belonged to far more dangerous criminals. The challenge now lay in exposing the truth before the conspirators completed their deadly housekeeping, as tonight's events had demonstrated their willingness to eliminate any threat to their elaborate deception with theatrical efficiency that masked cold-blooded planning. As the last flames died to glowing embers and the village began its return to uneasy normalcy, Miss Marple reflected that the Widow of Blackthorne Lane had orchestrated her most ambitious performance yet. The fire had served multiple masters, destroying evidence, providing false resolution, and demonstrating the lengths to which the conspirators would go to protect their secrets. Yet even the most careful criminals eventually revealed themselves through the very precision of their deceptions, and Miss Marple intended to be watching when those crucial errors finally exposed the truth behind Little Wickham's reign of terror disguised as tragic coincidence. The morning brought developments that would prove decisive in exposing the conspiracy's true scope, beginning with an urgent telegram from Scotland Yard that Inspector Craddock shared with barely concealed excitement, revealing that Dr. Marcus Thornfield had been under investigation for his involvement in a sophisticated art forgery ring operating from his former Harley Street practice. The Metropolitan Police had connected the doctor to fraudulent authentication schemes that used his medical respectability to provide credibility for pieces sold to wealthy collectors who valued discretion over due diligence, while his sudden retirement and disappearance from London coincided precisely with the intensified investigation that had finally gathered sufficient evidence for prosecution. Miss Marple received this confirmation of her suspicions with quiet satisfaction, though she recognized that official scrutiny created new dangers for anyone who might threaten the conspirators' carefully constructed new identities in Little Wickham. The second revelation arrived through the village postman, who delivered a package addressed to the vicarage that had been redirected from the King's Arms, bearing Julian Marchmont's careful handwriting and the ominous instruction, "To be opened by the Reverend Alton only in the event of my illness or death." Its London postmark dated just hours before the fatal garden party. The vicar, unnerved but dutiful, summoned both Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple to witness the opening, revealing contents that transformed the entire investigation. A leather-bound ledger documenting art transactions with suspicious dual titles suggesting originals and forgeries, photographic negatives showing interior shots of Blackthorne House taken at night, and most significantly, a pressed white orchid whose pale petals bore faint brown stains like fingerprints. The ledger contained meticulous records written in Marchmont's economical script, listing paintings with their authentic titles, followed by quotation-marked alternatives that hinted at systematic deception, alongside prices that suggested profits impossible to explain through legitimate commissions. Several entries aligned perfectly with pieces currently hanging at Blackthorne House, while the corresponding sums indicated a forgery operation of remarkable sophistication and profitability that extended far beyond mere village art, dealing into international criminal enterprise. The photographic negatives, when held to the light, revealed nighttime interior shots of the Colonel's study, showing frames tilted aside, labels being examined and replaced, and most damning of all, the study safe, standing open with documents spread across the desk, while a shadowy figure in silk moved near the windowsill. Miss Marple's examination of the evidence convinced her that Marchmont had been systematically documenting the conspiracy's operations, gathering proof of the systematic replacement of authentic pieces with sophisticated forgeries, while the originals were sold through London galleries to unsuspecting collectors who trusted the authentication provided by respected medical professionals. The third development came through Ada Finch, Mrs. Blackthorne's maid, who had been discovered in the scullery that morning in a state of confusion and distress, claiming an accident with the gas oven that had left her dizzy and frightened. Miss Marple's visit to Blackthorne House revealed that Ada's terror stemmed not from gas poisoning, but from witnessing something that had made her fear for her position and possibly her life. Her nervous glances toward the inner passage suggesting she had observed clandestine activities that the household's masters preferred to keep private. When Miss Marple gently questioned Ada about her duties, the maid revealed that she had been instructed to purchase additional beeswax from Mr. Pritchard on the afternoon of the greenhouse fire, ostensibly for draft-proofing, though she had encountered Dr. Thornfield in the lane, carrying a small valise that clinked suspiciously and smelled of paraffin. The convergence of evidence prompted Miss Marple to pay a formal call on Mrs. Blackthorne, arriving with her knitting and the deceptively innocent manner that had served her so well in previous investigations. Finding the widow and Dr. Thornfield in the drawing-room, where their carefully maintained composure began to crack under gentle but persistent questioning. She inquired with apparent casualness about the pristine condition of the key found in Marchmont's hand, noting that a key supposedly used to force entry into a study locked for 6 months should bear microscopic traces of its struggle with the mechanism rather than gleaming with suspicious cleanliness. Mrs. Blackthorne's explanation that art dealers maintained meticulous habits rang hollow when Miss Marple mentioned the crushed white orchid petal found near the body, a specimen from the rare Phalaenopsis aphrodite that Colonel Blackthorne had cultivated exclusively in his supposedly sealed private greenhouse. Dr. Thornfield's discomfort became increasingly evident as Miss Marple described the sophisticated extraction methods required to create the concentrated alkaloid found on Marchmont's fingers, his medical expertise making him uniquely qualified to prepare such lethal substances, while his convenient arrival in Little Wickham immediately after the Colonel's death suggested coordination rather than romantic coincidence. The psychological pressure intensified when Miss Marple mentioned Mr. Hartwell's suspicious collapse after discussing the Colonel's questionable land dealings, Dr. Thornfield's diagnosis of food poisoning, providing convenient cover for silencing another potential witness to the conspiracy's broader criminal activities. The widow's composure finally cracked when Miss Marple observed that the forged confession found in the greenhouse ruins bore watermarks facing the wrong direction, a detail that revealed hasty preparation by someone unfamiliar with the household's recent stationary changes, while Dr. Thornfield's violent reaction to continued questioning demonstrated the guilt and desperation of criminals whose elaborate deception was finally being exposed by an elderly lady whose knitting needles had never stopped their steady rhythm throughout the deadly game. Miss Marple's invitation to tea at the vicarage that afternoon carried the deceptive innocence of a church social. Yet she had arranged the gathering with the precision of a chess master positioning pieces for checkmate, requesting that Mrs. Blackthorne and Dr. Thornfield join her for what she termed a small matter of clarification regarding poor Lily's situation. The Reverend Alton had graciously provided his drawing-room for this purpose, while Inspector Craddock waited discreetly in the adjacent study, his presence known but not visible, creating an atmosphere of informal discussion rather than official interrogation. Miss Marple had positioned herself near the window where the afternoon light caught the small collection of items she had arranged on the tea table with seemingly casual precision. 2 lion's head keys on a silver tray, a stick of red sealing wax, a roll of beeswax wrapped in brown paper, and Marchmont's posthumous package with its damning contents displayed like afternoon reading material. The psychological trap began to close as Miss Marple engaged her guests in gentle conversation about household management, mentioning with apparent casualness how different people handled various materials, particularly wax for sealing letters or taking impressions, observing with her characteristic mildness that habits often revealed more about a person than their words ever could. Dr. Thornfield's initial composure began to crack when she described the sophisticated extraction methods required to create the concentrated alkaloid found on Marchmont's fingers, his medical expertise making him uniquely qualified to understand such processes, while his defensive reactions suggested guilty knowledge rather than professional curiosity. Mrs. Blackthorne's carefully maintained facade of grieving widowhood showed similar stress fractures when Miss Marple mentioned the pristine condition of the key found in the dead man's hand, noting that a key supposedly used to force entry into a study locked for 6 months should bear microscopic traces of struggle rather than gleaming with suspicious cleanliness. The revelation of Marchmont's systematic documentation through his hidden ledger, and photographic evidence created palpable tension in the drawing room as Miss Marple described with quiet authority how the art dealer had been investigating a sophisticated forgery operation involving the systematic replacement of authentic pieces in Colonel Blackthorne's collection, while the originals were sold through London galleries that benefited from medical authentication provided by respected physicians with questionable ethics. The widow's explanation that such accusations were preposterous collapsed when confronted with photographic negatives showing nighttime activities in the colonel's study. Images that captured silk-gloved hands examining frames and replacing authentication certificates with documents bearing stolen letterheads from legitimate galleries. Dr. Thornfield's medical composure finally shattered when Miss Marple produced the pressed white orchid from Marchmont's package, its pale petals bearing faint brown stains that she identified as traces of the concentrated alkaloid used to poison the art dealer, a specimen of Phalaenopsis aphrodite that Colonel Blackthorne had cultivated exclusively in his supposedly sealed private greenhouse using specialized techniques described in correspondence with botanical experts. The doctor's violent objection that such botanical theories were nonsensical revealed expertise that contradicted his claimed ignorance of plant-based toxins, while his intimate knowledge of extraction procedures betrayed familiarity with methods that extended far beyond casual medical practice into deliberate criminal application. Mrs. Blackthorne's psychological defenses crumbled entirely when Miss Marple mentioned with devastating gentleness that the forged confession found in the greenhouse ruins bore watermarks facing the wrong direction, a detail that revealed hasty preparation by someone unfamiliar with the household's recent stationery changes, while the convenient timing of the fire that destroyed botanical evidence suggested coordination rather than desperate improvisation by a trapped servant girl. The widow's attempts to maintain her performance of innocent grief became increasingly transparent as Miss Marple systematically dismantled each element of their elaborate deception, from the duplicate key created through wax impressions to the systematic poisoning of witnesses who threatened their profitable conspiracy. The final psychological blow came when Miss Marple revealed that she had already shared copies of Marchmont's evidence with multiple parties for safekeeping, explaining with characteristic foresight that her years of experience with village mysteries had taught her the wisdom of preparing for various contingencies when dealing with criminals who had demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their secrets. The knowledge that their crimes were documented and secured beyond their reach transformed the conspirators' careful coordination into desperate panic, as both realized that their elaborate performance was finally being exposed by an elderly lady whose modest appearance had concealed formidable investigative abilities and an understanding of human nature that penetrated even the most sophisticated deceptions. Dr. Thornfield's admission came first, his medical training unable to overcome the psychological pressure of Miss Marple's relentless but gentle questioning, as he confessed to providing the botanical expertise necessary to poison Colonel Blackthorne when the old man threatened to expose their forgery operation to protect his reputation. Mrs. Blackthorne's collapse followed inevitably, her elegant composure dissolving into tears as she revealed how the partnership had begun with simple art authentication, but had escalated into systematic fraud and ultimately murder when witnesses became too dangerous to tolerate. The conspiracy's true scope emerged through their broken confessions. Multiple deaths disguised as natural causes, systematic elimination of evidence, and the careful manipulation of an innocent young woman to bear guilt that belonged to criminals whose combination of medical knowledge and artistic expertise had created the perfect conditions for sophisticated deceptions in the peaceful village of Little Wickham, where Miss Marple's patient observation had finally brought justice to those who believed themselves beyond the reach of simple village morality. The drawing room at the vicarage had settled into that peculiar hush which follows the collapse of elaborate pretense, and Miss Marple, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm, undertook the gentle but inexorable task of explaining how the deadly performance had been orchestrated from beginning to end. She did not look directly at Mrs. Blackthorne and Dr. Thornfield as she spoke, but rather addressed her remarks to Inspector Craddock and the assembled witnesses, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had observed human nature in all its complexity for many decades. The conspiracy, she explained with characteristic mildness, had begun long before Colonel Blackthorne's convenient death, rooted in a partnership between Helena Carroway, as she was then known, and Dr. Thornfield that extended far beyond romantic attachment into sophisticated criminal collaboration involving art forgeries and the systematic elimination of inconvenient witnesses. The Colonel's death 6 months earlier had been the first murder, disguised with medical precision as natural cardiac complications through the gradual administration of concentrated alkaloids extracted from rare orchids in his private greenhouse. Dr. Thornfield's botanical expertise, initially presented as scholarly retirement interest, had actually been preparation for systematic poisoning using plant-based toxins that mimicked natural causes while avoiding official scrutiny. The timing had been carefully orchestrated to coincide with the doctor's supposed relocation to Little Wickham, creating the appearance of romantic coincidence rather than criminal coordination designed to inherit both the Colonel's collection and his profitable forgery operation. Julian Marchmont's growing suspicions had made him the conspiracy's next target, his expertise in art authentication allowing him to detect subtle signs of forgery that less trained observers might miss. The art dealer's systematic documentation through his hidden ledger and nighttime photography had created evidence threatening to expose not only the systematic replacement of authentic pieces in the Colonel's collection, but the broader network of London galleries that had been deceived by fraudulent authentication services provided by a respected physician with questionable ethics. His death had required more immediate action than the Colonel's gradual poisoning, necessitating direct application of concentrated botanical extract while he examined authentication certificates in the conservatory. Miss Marple lifted the pristine lion's head key from the tea table, explaining with devastating gentleness that this crucial piece of evidence revealed the conspiracy's theatrical nature rather than confirming official theories about attempted burglary. A key supposedly used to force entry into a study locked for 6 months should bear microscopic scratches from the mechanism's interior, perhaps dust from disuse or oil from the tumblers. Yet, this specimen gleamed with suspicious cleanliness that spoke of careful polishing rather than desperate use. The key had never opened the Colonel's study because the room had remained accessible to those who owned the house and controlled its secrets, serving instead as misdirection while the real evidence of criminal operations was systematically destroyed. The crushed white orchid petals she had preserved from the crime scene provided equally damning evidence of the conspiracy's sophisticated planning and desperate cover-up attempts. The specimen belonged to Phalaenopsis Aphrodite, a rare variety Colonel Blackthorne had cultivated exclusively in his locked private greenhouse, using specialized techniques that required expert knowledge and careful maintenance. Its presence near Marchmont's body in the public conservatory revealed that the art dealer had gained access to areas supposedly sealed since the Colonel's death, discovering secrets that had cost him his life when he encountered the very people who had been maintaining those deadly botanical resources in secret. The convenient greenhouse fire that had followed Marchmont's death served multiple criminal purposes that demonstrated the conspirators' willingness to eliminate evidence through theatrical destruction while providing false resolution to official inquiries. The flames had destroyed botanical evidence of toxin extraction methods, eliminated tools used for poison preparation, and created perfect cover for planting the forged confession that would have sealed poor Lily Pemberton's fate. Yet even this elaborate performance contained telling errors that revealed hasty preparation by criminals under pressure, particularly the watermark facing the wrong direction on stationery that Mrs. Blackthorne had ordered after her husband's death. A detail that betrayed unfamiliarity with recent household changes. Dr. Thornfield's medical expertise had provided both means and method for the conspiracy's deadly efficiency. his knowledge of botanical chemistry enabling the creation of sophisticated toxins, while his professional respectability offered authentication services that commanded premium prices from collectors who valued discretion over traditional expertise. His violent reaction to Miss Marple's gentle questioning about plant-based poisons had revealed guilty knowledge rather than academic interest, while his convenient diagnoses of food poisoning and gas accidents had provided cover for silencing additional witnesses whose knowledge threatened their elaborate deception. Poor Lily Pemberton had been selected as the perfect scapegoat through careful manipulation that exploited her vulnerable position as dependent companion, her nervous temperament and desperate circumstances providing convenient explanation for crimes requiring expertise she could never possess. The botanical reference books found in her room were common among country dwellers, hardly evidence of the specialized chemical knowledge necessary to extract concentrated alkaloids from exotic orchids, while her genuine distress and confusion contrasted sharply with the calculating composure her employers had maintained throughout their deadly performance. Inspector Craddock stepped forward with grim satisfaction, the formal charges echoing through the quiet vicarage as Mrs. Blackthorne's elegant facade finally crumbled and Dr. Thornfield's scientific detachment dissolved into desperate babbling. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with characteristic composure, reflecting that even the most sophisticated criminals eventually revealed themselves through the very precision of their deceptions, their belief in intellectual superiority blinding them to the simple truth that guilt always leaves traces for those who understand how to read the subtle patterns of human behavior. Outside, Little Wickham began its gradual return to peaceful normalcy, though the widow's house stood empty now, its blinds drawn like eyes that had finally closed on secrets too terrible for daylight. The tranquil facade of Little Wickham settled back into place, with the peculiar resilience that English villages possess after storms, though Miss Marple, who never mistook quiet surfaces for genuine peace, observed how the depths continued to move beneath the carefully restored normalcy. Within a week of the arrests, the baker's van resumed its cheerful rounds and the post office clock maintained its reliable chimes, yet something fundamental had shifted in the community's understanding of itself and the dangers that could lurk beneath the most respectable appearances. The village wore its calm like a well-tailored coat, concealing the alterations that had been necessary to accommodate its changed understanding of recent events. Lily Pemberton's release from custody brought tears of relief that seemed to wash away weeks of accumulated fear and confusion, though the young woman bore the haunted expression of someone who had stared into an abyss not of her own making. Miss Marple visited her at the vicarage where she was recovering under Mrs. Alton's gentle ministrations, finding the girl eager to understand how such elaborate deception had been possible and why she had been selected as the convenient victim for crimes she could never have conceived. The explanation came gradually, with Miss Marple's characteristic patience, revealing how her vulnerable position as dependent companion had made her perfect for bearing guilt that belonged to far more calculating criminals. A place was soon found for Lily with a conscientious dressmaker in Eastbourne, where neat fingers mattered more than personal history, and where the girl could begin rebuilding her faith in human nature away from the shadows of Blackthorne Lane. Inspector Craddock's expanded investigation, now armed with Julian Marchmont's systematic documentation and Miss Marple's careful observations, revealed the conspiracy's true scope extending far beyond Little Wickham into an international network of galleries, collectors, and medical professionals who had been deceived by fraudulent authentication services. The art dealer's hidden ledger contained records spanning several years, showing how authentic pieces from private collections were systematically replaced with sophisticated forgeries, while the originals were sold through London galleries to unsuspecting buyers who trusted the medical authentication provided by Dr. Thornfield's supposed expertise. Scotland Yard's subsequent raids uncovered a back room off Marylebone Road where two originals waited beside their brighter imitations, the gilt pulled from cheap frames to reveal the criminal enterprise's true nature. The revelation of Mrs. Helena Blackthorne's true identity as Helena Caraway, a woman with a documented history of assuming false personas and manipulating wealthy gentlemen through carefully cultivated relationships, sent shockwaves through the village's social fabric. Her partnership with Dr. Thornfield extended back several years to London, where they had operated their sophisticated authentication service under cover of medical respectability while generating enormous profits from collectors who valued discretion over traditional expertise. The couple's decision to eliminate Colonel Blackthorne when he threatened to expose their operations had been calculated with the same cold precision they had applied to their forgery business, transforming the peaceful greenhouse into a laboratory for death where rare orchids provided concentrated alkaloids that could mimic natural causes. Blackthorne House itself became a monument to the conspiracy's collapse, its windows dark and gardens showing signs of neglect as the community struggled to process the transformation of a symbol of respectability into evidence of sophisticated criminal deception. The conservatory where Marchmont had died remained sealed pending official investigation, while the charred ruins of the Colonel's private greenhouse served as a blackened reminder of how far the conspirators had been willing to go to destroy evidence of their deadly expertise. No one in Little Wickham seemed eager to purchase the property, its walls now imbued with the chilling legacy of murder and betrayal that made even the bravest residents avert their eyes when passing. Mr. Hartwell's recovery from his convenient illness brought sheepish admissions that his personal grievances against Marchmont had blinded him to the art dealer's genuine efforts to expose criminal activity, while his experience with near poisoning had visibly chastened him, stripping away some of his self-importance and replacing it with quiet caution. Mrs. Bantry's dramatic pronouncements about always suspecting something amiss rang hollow when compared to her previous enthusiasm for gossip that had supported the false narrative, leading to uncomfortable self-examination about the dangers of accepting appearances without proper scrutiny. The village's gradual healing process revealed how thoroughly the community had been manipulated by performances that had seemed entirely natural at the time, creating a new wariness that tempered Little Wickham's traditional openness with hard-won wisdom about human nature's capacity for deception. The illusion of complete safety had been irrevocably shattered, replaced by a more nuanced understanding that even in the most peaceful English villages, beneath the veneer of civility, could lurk hidden resentments and personal betrayals that might fester into deadly crimes. Miss Marple herself returned to her quiet routines with the familiar satisfaction of a puzzle solved and justice served, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm as she reflected on the case's broader implications for understanding human behavior. The conspiracy had succeeded as long as it had, because the criminals understood how to exploit community expectations and social conventions, using their sophisticated knowledge and respectable facades to deflect suspicion while systematically eliminating threats to their profitable deception. Yet their very sophistication had ultimately betrayed them, as their belief in intellectual superiority had blinded them to the simple truth that guilt always leaves traces for those who understand how to read the subtle patterns of authentic human behavior beneath carefully constructed performances. As autumn deepened over Little Wickham and the memorial garden resumed its peaceful purpose under the vicar's wife's careful management, Miss Marple permitted herself the small luxury of being the sort of elderly lady whom nobody notices too closely, and who, by being nobody in particular, could sometimes be of the greatest use to everybody. The world remained full of such puzzles, she reflected with quiet satisfaction, and she would always be ready to solve them, one careful stitch at a time, guided by the unchanging truth that wickedness, no matter how clever, inevitably reveals itself to those who possess the patience to observe and the wisdom to understand what they see. The first frost of winter had settled over Little Wickham like a gentle benediction, transforming the village green into a crystalline tableau that seemed to cleanse the air of lingering shadows from the previous autumn's dark revelations. Miss Marple, observing from her sitting-room window as she maintained the steady rhythm of her knitting needles, noted how the community had wrapped itself in the comforting rituals of Christmas preparation with an almost deliberate normalcy, though beneath the surface, current of wassail and carol practice flowed deeper changes that spoke of hard-won wisdom about the nature of human deception. The trial proceedings had concluded just before Advent, with Helena Carroway and Dr. Marcus Thornfield receiving sentences that reflected both the sophisticated nature of their crimes and the calculated cruelty with which they had eliminated anyone who threatened their profitable conspiracy. The judge, a man of considerable experience with criminal ingenuity, had remarked that the truest disguises were those worn in plain sight, observing that the defendants' very respectability had been their most effective weapon against suspicion. Dr. Thornfield's medical expertise, once a source of professional pride, had become the very evidence that condemned him, his knowledge of botanical chemistry proving his unique capability to create the exotic poisons that had claimed both Colonel Blackthorne and Julian Marchmont with such clinical precision. Scotland Yard's expanded investigation had revealed the conspiracy's true scope, extending far beyond Little Wickham into an international network of galleries, collectors, and medical professionals who had been systematically deceived by fraudulent authentication services. Marchmont's posthumous vindication as a legitimate investigator rather than a charlatan had brought some comfort to those who had misjudged his final efforts, though the village remained sobered by how completely they had been manipulated by performances that had seemed entirely natural at the time. The art dealer's hidden ledger had proven invaluable in recovering authentic masterpieces worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, while several London galleries faced uncomfortable questions about their authentication procedures and the medical credentials they had accepted without proper scrutiny. Lily Pemberton's transformation provided the case's most satisfying resolution. Her Christmas letter, arriving on cream-colored paper that spoke of newfound prosperity and, more importantly, peace of mind. The Eastbourne dressmaker had recognized her natural talents for detailed work, while the girl's confidence had slowly recovered from the trauma of being falsely accused of crimes she could never have conceived. Her photograph, enclosed with careful pride, showed her surrounded by bolts of silk and lace in a shop window that bore her name in modest gold lettering, evidence that honest industry could triumph over the most sophisticated attempts to destroy an innocent life. Inspector Craddock's professional development had proven equally remarkable, his encounters with Miss Marple having fundamentally altered his approach to criminal investigation. He now looked beyond obvious evidence to the subtle patterns of human behavior. His reports, including observations about character assessment and habitual conduct that initially puzzled his superiors, but proved increasingly effective in solving complex cases. His Christmas visit to Miss Marple, ostensibly to return a volume on botanical identification that he had never borrowed, provided opportunity for quiet conversation about the enduring lessons of the Blackthorne affair and the wisdom of questioning convenient narratives that satisfied official expectations while concealing deeper truths. The village itself had undergone subtle but significant changes in its social fabric, with residents displaying newfound caution in their judgments while retaining their essential kindness and community spirit. Mrs. Bantry's dramatic pronouncements now carried qualifying phrases that suggested hard-won humility about the limitations of surface observation, while Mr. Hartwell's experience with near poisoning had visibly chastened him, replacing some of his self-important bluster with quiet reflection about the dangers of nursing personal grievances without considering their broader implications. The collective trust, once so easily given to those who maintained respectable facades, was now harder earned, replaced by nuanced understanding that even familiar faces might conceal hidden resentments capable of erupting into deadly crimes. Blackthorne House remained empty throughout the winter months, its dark windows and neglected gardens serving as a constant reminder of how thoroughly evil had disguised itself behind facades of social prominence and charitable activity. The property's sale had proven impossible despite reasonable pricing, as no family seemed willing to inhabit rooms where such elaborate deception had been planned and executed with cold precision. The conservatory, where Marchmont had died, remained sealed pending final legal proceedings, while the site of the Colonel's private greenhouse had been cleared and planted with simple evergreens that would, in time, blend the disturbed earth back into the natural landscape. Miss Marple herself had returned to her quiet routines with the familiar satisfaction of justice served and innocence protected, yet she carried with her the deeper understanding that each case provided about the unchanging patterns of human motivation beneath society's evolving methods of deception. The conspiracy had succeeded as long as it had because the criminals understood how to exploit community expectations and social conventions, using their specialized knowledge and respectable positions to deflect suspicion while systematically eliminating threats to their elaborate fraud. Their very sophistication had ultimately betrayed them, however, as their belief in intellectual superiority had blinded them to the simple truth that guilt always leaves traces for those who possess the patience to observe and the wisdom to understand what they see. As the shortest day passed and Little Wickham began its gradual turn toward spring, Miss Marple reflected that the world would always contain such puzzles, requiring those who understood that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most respectable, and that justice, however delayed by clever disguises and sophisticated planning, would eventually find its way to those who believed themselves beyond its reach. Her knitting continued its steady progress, each careful stitch a small act of faith that truth would always emerge for those who knew how to look for it, and that the simple virtues of patience, observation, and moral courage remained humanity's best defenses against the eternal human capacity for wickedness, dressed in the finest clothes that money and education could provide. Outside, the village green lay peaceful under its blanket of snow, and Miss Marple permitted herself the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her small corner of England remained safe for decent people to live their lives without fear of sophisticated predators who mistook respectability for immunity from the consequences of their choices. There would always be other mysteries, other villages where human hearts continued their ancient business of wanting and fearing and hiding, and she would always be ready to unravel them, one patient observation at a time, guided by the unchanging truth that wickedness, no matter how clever, inevitably reveals itself to those who understand that the most important clues lie not in laboratories or ledgers, but in the eternal patterns of human behavior that no amount of sophistication can entirely conceal.